right. We still got folks signing in, but I got 7:30. We're going to be punctual this evening and get started right on time. My name's Katie Lineberger. I am your presenter this evening. You are in the Single Board 101 workshop. So if that's not where you intended to be, you're welcome to stay. But just so you know, that's where you are this evening. Before we get started, I'm grateful to my colleague, Chris Mars, who serves in the with me in the URI district. She's our producer this evening, our tech person. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris for a minute for just a couple little housekeeping things to make sure things run smoothly for us. So Chris, turn it over to you.
Hey friends, I'm so glad that you're joining us on the Zoom tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping points so that we can all hear. I will remind you to just keep yourself, keep yourself muted during Katie's presentation. There may be time at the end for some discussion, and there may be time at the end for us to go into some breakout rooms, but until then, if you would just keep yourself muted, that will help everybody be able to hear well. And then also, we'll be utilizing the chat feature some throughout the night. So if you can make sure your chat box is open, and if you need help with either of those two, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be what looks like a microphone and then something that says chat. So you can see those two things. And if you have questions, just ask it in the chat box and I'll try and help you out from there. Thanks, Katie.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so before I get started, I want to, again, my name is Katie Lineberger. I'm in the URI district. I'm the Vitality Associate. And I also pastor Main Street United Methodist Church in Albemarle. I have been working on single board governance for a few years now. Trained a lot of churches in doing it. Before we get into the main, the bulk of, I want to share a couple of disclaimers, some assumptions I'm making as we get into this evening. So first of all, this presentation is intended primarily for folks who have already implemented a single board structure. That's not to say that if you haven't and you've come to just maybe hear a little bit about it, you'll learn some stuff, but this really is intended for some kind of nuts and bolts and folks that are maybe new on the leadership board, to kind of give a rundown of, because it's different, right? Instead of being just a trustee or a finance person, you are all of those things. And so we're going to kind of touch a little bit on each of those. Again, if you're just kind of listening in, curious about this, that's totally fine too. But there's a different presentation that I have to introduce the model. So just so you're aware, and if you want that another time, you can message me or email me. I'll share my information at the end. Also, the model that I'm sharing, everything I'm sharing tonight are best practices, okay? They're not prescriptive. Take what works for you, what sounds interesting, and set the rest aside, right? But what I'm sharing are the things that we have found that work best in churches, but this model is intended to be helpful and not intrusive, and really help you live into your mission and vision and allow that to lead you. So utilize as much or as little as you want. So I just want to go over real quickly some of the things that we're going to cover. I'm going to give a brief refresher on the role of a single board, and what the governance piece looks like, talk a little bit about accountability. We're going to talk about the role of the chair. I imagine some of you are the chairperson. I hope, that some of you might be the chairperson. And so we're going to talk about the role of the chairperson from meeting prep to execution, and to follow up. We're also going to talk about the board functions and responsibilities. I've kind of got kind of job descriptions, right? As a trustees, the board is responsible for this. As the finance, as SPRC and church council, this is what the board is supposed to function as. And then we will talk about, we'll do an overview of maybe a year of leadership as a single board structure and kind of look through what some of the topics might be as your group meets. A lot of single boards will meet once a month. So we'll kind of go through the whole year, kind of look at some of those big blocks as that might be agenda items that you might cover as a single board. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end, and if we have time, if time permits, we can do some breakout groups. Because I think it'd be really important for you all, because you might be have implemented single board slightly different from what I train people in, and you might have some ideas and best practices, and I want you guys to be able to share those with each other, because I'm not the stop on single board governance. Again, these are best practices that we have found work. So that's just a couple of assumptions. I'm going to now share my screen, and we're going to get started. And again, please utilize the chat. Chris will be monitoring that, and at the end, she'll help me get to some of the big questions. Let me get this to this different screen. There we go. All right. So let's get started. So this single board governance leadership 101. So we're not introducing the model as a whole, but really this is how you implement it in the new year. So just a reminder, the whole point of a single board is to ensure that there is one body in the church every month is looking at the big picture, right? That is intentionally meeting to look at the vision and the mission of the church and how are we doing in that. They're not necessarily planning the little details of all the events and the goings on to the church, but they're looking at the big picture. And that's what governance, when we say governance, right? It's ensuring that programs, everything is in line with the mission and vision. You're reviewing any changes that may have happened in the community or the church. COVID, was one of those big changes that has taken place, and it's time to relook at demographics. The board does a lot of policy setting, right? You're writing the policies of the church that make it possible for the worker bees to do the work of the church without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. And then you're setting the annual goals for the church and holding staff accountable for those goals and the stewardship of finances. So those are just some those are big blocks, big picture, what governance is, what the role of the board is in governance. So these are the questions that drive the work of the board, right? Again, these are not little details of like, what color are we going to change the carpet to in the sanctuary, or who's going to manage the table at the community event. No, the board is looking at who are we, who is our neighbor, what is our definition of a disciple, how will we do ministry in a manner that nurtures discipleship, and what are the boundaries that will focus our ministry. That's the accountability piece, because the whole goal and point of the single board is to give the people who we have given all the responsibility to also the authority to make decisions. But we want to do that within some boundaries. And so these are the questions of the board, and I'll be happy to share the presentation with you all. We'll send in the follow-up email. And so don't feel like you have to like jot everything down. I'm happy to share all of this information. But these are the questions as a board, right? The hope is that at the board meeting, you're having one conversation, each meeting, maybe addressing one of these questions. Because I don't know how many, I've been a pastor about 15 years, and I haven't been to a whole lot of church meetings where we've talked about how we are doing at making disciples, right? We're talking about the event that we did last year, and do we want to do it this year? Not necessarily how are we doing at making disciples. And so the single board is the body in which kind of focuses on that. So that's really important. Just a little overview of that. So let's talk about accountability, because we're giving authority to our worker bees, right? We're giving authority to our pastors to be able to make some decisions, to our maintenance, our building and maintenance folks, the folks that like to fix things. we're giving them authority to be able to do that, right? Without having to go through 5 committees to make a decision. But this doesn't work if we don't hold others accountable. And accountability is kind of a scary thing to us. We think, I don't know, that maybe we're being mean if we're holding people accountable. But holding others accountable is simple with this little acronym here, right? It's simply, this is what accountability is. It's you're setting expectations, and that's through your goals, right? The board needs to set the goals, set the agenda for the church. This is what we are hoping to achieve. And then you invite commitment from the congregation, from your paid and unpaid staff, your leaders, to buy into this. And then you kind of measure progress. And this is done through like strategic planning, like checking in. How are we doing? Do we need to reevaluate this? Provide feedback. And then, there's always there might be cases in which you need to link to consequences, because again, there's boundaries, and sometimes people try to push those boundaries, and then evaluate effectiveness. So that's, accountability very much in a nutshell, but, it's a lot of authority you have, right? As a single board. This, typically how I present it is no more than 9 voting members for trustees purposes. And that's a lot of power for 9 people, right? And so this does not work if you're not holding, if there's not accountability in place. And so this is really, really key. So again, best practice. This is what I recommend our single board churches use as an agenda, an example of that anyway. You begin with an opening prayer, spiritual formation, and leadership development. Now, most church meetings at least begin with prayer and sometimes a devotion. But you are the leaders of the church. You're making big time decisions and holding very gently, right, this mission and vision, this great task that God has handed you. And unless you're tending, and hopefully you are able to find some small groups to be a part of, but how wonderful is it that we're spending time in our meeting to really invest in that spiritual formation and leadership development. They're 2 separate pieces. So the first half hour of the meeting is investing in you as leaders. Ideally, those 2 pieces are shared among the whole board, that you rotate that. And the spiritual formation piece is scripture and a devotional thought. It's some kind of focused conversation with discussion around some kind of aspect of faith. It can be a prayer practice. It can be all sorts of things, right? Because spiritual formation is a lot of things. So however you interpret that, whatever feeds your spirit, and you can invite the group. For leadership development, a lot of churches will take a book. Maybe the pastor has a leadership focus that they see as important, and maybe as a board you take a year or 6 months, maybe break the year up into 2 and take 6 months to look at one book and then a second book. So you would take one chapter from that book and talk about it. Somebody in the group would lead a conversation. I often recommend Pete Scazzaro. He's got some emotionally healthy discipleship, emotionally healthy spirituality. And I've had some churches have some really fruitful with their single board, have some really good conversations around that. But that's something to talk about with your pastor on what they think would be important. But really investing in you as leaders of the church. So that's the first half of the meeting, right? And ideally the pastor is not leading that, but that's coming from you all. And then every meeting, you're going to review visitors. Who's been coming? Who came, back a second time? Who followed up? What are their names? Like, how are we engaging them? Really spending some time looking at who's coming through your doors and how are you doing at following up with them and getting them engaged and learning their story too, right? Who's building those relationships? So that's a really important piece, a part of this conversation. And then next is where you would review your goal progression. So ideally, as a church, you have a vision. You've done some visioning and you have an idea with your pastor, you've done the work of kind of discerning where you want the church to be down the road, who you guys have discerned, how God has called you all to make disciples as a congregation in your context. And from that vision, you've developed some goals for the year, right? I just had a meeting today with my church and we kind of talked about some goals. What do we hope to accomplish this year, right? And so now that we've got that, at our next few meetings, we're going to kind of evaluate the things that we do each time. Okay, how are we doing at building, working towards this goal of whatever it might be, but each meeting, but you have to have a goal in place in order to have that conversation. So that's really important, just to bring some intention to whatever activities or events you all plan. So the packet and the consent calendar items. This is a lot of things, right? What you notice is not a part of this agenda is reports. So many meetings are spent on reporting, and it is important to hear about what people are doing, but not in this meeting, right? And so there's a way to hear those, to see those reports without having to spend time talking about what we have done, again, because that gets into the role of the micromanaging little nitty-gritty details. So the packet and the consent calendar items are your reports. So the hope is that you're emailing the leaders of all your different ministries, your United Women of Faith, your Methodist men, your youth or children, if you have that, whatever different committees you have or teams that you have, and you're saying, hey, if you have something that you would like to, let the board know what you have going on, here's your form to fill out for your report. And so you have people submit those reports about a week in advance. And then as the board chair, you're sending that out ahead of time. And as part of your commitment as a board, is that you're going to commit to reading these reports before you attend the meeting. And if there's anything in those that need to be brought up to the board, that need board approval, then you can discuss those. But you're not spending time in the meeting where we're talking about big picture things, kind of doing some of the hands-on managing, because we're giving that to the people who like the worker bees. Also included in the packet and consent calendar items are your finance reports, right? Things like that. If you do monthly financials, that's a good place to do that. And again, you can, during this line item, ask if there's any questions or concerns about things, but you're not spending, maybe more than 10 minutes on this packet and consent calendar items. And I also want to say, if you're not implementing these things, but you're interested, I have tons of resources I can send you. And so I'm happy to do that. And I'll be sure to share all that stuff in Hoover after this is over. And then after you kind of approve those packet and consent calendar items, this is when you're going to start doing the generative and the strategic work. And I'm going to go over that when I kind of go over like the leadership of a year. I'll kind of, I'll share what that more specifically, what that work could look like. But that, again, that's your big picture things of the church. You want to make sure, because it's a centralized leadership, that you spend time talking about how you're going to communicate, right? What needs to be communicated and who is communicating this information and how are we communicating this information? So you want to make sure you have a conversation about that at the end. Is this going to go in a newsletter? Is this going to go in an email? Are we going to have a town hall to allow people to provide us feedback on, what they're seeing and hearing? So you want to make sure you have that, what we talked about, what needs to be shared, and then of course end with prayer. So that is there's our agenda. I do want to say, as I want to back up just a minute, as the board chair, in order to prep for the meeting, you've heard me working with the pastor to prepare the agenda, get those consent calendar, the consent calendar items together, and then to notify, whoever on your board is doing the spiritual formation and leadership development, that one. So that's the meeting prep. Some tips about when you're in the meeting. Ideally, you're staying out of management, right? When you are talking about some big picture things and you find yourselves talking about, are we going to let, so and so wants to host this group in our church, and you start getting into the details about that, like, well, like, are we going to charge them, or how long is it going to meet, or what are they going to study, right? That's not necessarily the role of the board. So what you'd ask yourself is there a policy that we could put in place so that it's easier for, for whoever to be able to implement this in the future, so they don't have to necessarily bring this to us in the future. Um, and then, yeah, okay, moving on. So let's talk about, so you've all got, 5 hats on. You're all trustees, you're all SPRC, all of you are finance, all of you are church council, you've got all those hats. So let's talk about your role as each of those. So as a trustee, the board is responsible for legal things, management of investments, overseeing legal matters, setting building use policies is probably the biggest piece. What you notice that is not here is the building and maintenance. Hopefully, ideally, you have a team for that, right? There is at least one person in your church that likes to fix things and is good at that. And I bet that person also does not like going to meetings. So we're not going to make them. We are going to allow the people that like to fix things to fix things. And so the trustee function of the board is not building and maintenance. The trustee is going to set those policies. Or, as a trustee, you're going to set those policies. As a board, you're going to give the building and maintenance team a budget. And you're going to say, you do what you need to do, as long as you don't go over this amount. You might put in a policy that says, if something major breaks and it's going to cost over $1,000, we'd like you to get 2 or 3 bids, right? And we'd like you to pick someone local, a local business and not some big commercial, right? Whatever kind of policies you want to set in place. Just thinking through how can you make it easy for a building and maintenance team to do what they need to do it quickly and effectively, because we trust them, right? I know I trust my building and maintenance guys. If something's wrong, I just want them to fix it. I don't want them to have to wait for a meeting in order to make some decisions about that. And that may already be happening. And that happens, I think, in a lot of churches. We have put a lot of trust in our building and maintenance guys. So anyway, this is the role of a trustee. So this will be kind of the conversation. If you need to have any conversations like that as a board, this is what it will be like as a trustees person. So as the finance committee, pretty simple. The board sets financial policies. If you don't already have financial policies in place, that might be one of the first things you tackle this year. Right, after your first meeting is begin to talk about the financial policies. How are we going to spend money? Who gets to spend money and how much? Things like that. Obviously you're going to approve your budget. You're going to talk about a stewardship campaign. You're going to make sure that you do an audit every year. Oversee and guide the work of whoever your treasurer and financial secretary are. Again, big picture things. You're just going to set those policies. You're not going to decide, if you're not going to have a meeting about whether or not the secretary can order some office supplies, right? Because you're going to just say, these people can spend their money as long as they don't go over budget. So that's the finance chair. Oh, my computer froze. Oh my. I'm having some technical difficulty here. Oh, there we go. Okay. As the church council, this is some of that big picture stuff. The board is responsible for, again, the vision and mission, set the goals of the church, review worship attendance. You kind of hit that in the agenda. Hopefully you're looking at visitors, assess retention of active disciples. This is really important. This is the important work, hugely important, right? Assessing your attention of active disciples, and you can determine what is an active disciple, right? And evaluate ministries for effectiveness as it relates to mission and vision. Again, something really important that gets overlooked sometimes. We have a great ministry event, And then there's no real conversation afterwards on what worked, what didn't, what we could do better next time. How can we build upon what we've done? So that's kind of the role of the board, is to do all of that work. And then as a SPRC person, you're setting employment policies. If you have staff, right? If you have more than just a pastor, maybe, or you have a secretary or a musician or a janitor or whatever, the board is going to be the one to kind of create those employee policies. Who can hire? Is the pastor allowed to hire people, right? The board might decide, well, we've gotten to a point where we need someone to do children and youth, right? We're gonna, the pastor's the one that's gonna be supervising them and managing their ministry. We're gonna let them hire them. We just want to make sure that the pastor brings in at least one or two other people to interview, right? So you're not having to bring a whole group of people together to do interviews. Again, you don't have to do that. I'm just giving some examples. You're gonna perform your evaluation as of your pastor. You're gonna work with the DS anytime that there's a pastoral change. Hugely important is advocating and supporting your pastor in the ministry and work-life balance. There are whole trainings. There's some really great trainings actually out there for staff pastor parish relations committees. And I encourage you to maybe look at those, especially through the Duke Clergy Health Initiative. Laura Hamrick is leading a workshop on one of those trainings later this week. And so if you're new to the SPRC role, I would encourage you to check that out. Again, that's kind of touching on that piece of like being an advocate and a support for your pastor and their ministry. But also as SPRC, you're going to recommend, like I said, new staff needed positions based and write those job descriptions. That's really important. Is to make sure there's job descriptions and expectations and all that, to make financial recommendations as it relates to staff. And then of course, to inspect the parsonage if you have one. And like I said, there's really great trainings out there for SPRC people, and I encourage you to seek those out if that's something that's quite new to you. I also want to say some of you might have a separate SPRC, and that's fine too. It's not necessarily that's not what I always recommend, just for like streamline things, but it's certainly if some district superintendents prefer that. And so I just want to say that that's totally fine too. All right, so let's look at your leadership through the year. Again, these are suggestions to give you some examples to help get the wheels in your head turning. So I don't know if any of you have met yet for your January meeting. Like I said, our church council just met today for the first meeting of the year. But at that first meeting as a single board, what's really important, the most important thing probably you need to do is, and it's real quick, is elect a trustee chair. Right, that's book of discipline. At the first council meeting, you've got to elect that trustee chair. Best practice is that your board chair is also the trustee chair. Just again, help simplify things. But you're going to introduce the new board. Also go over the board covenant. That would include things like what's required and expected of your participation in the church, worship attendance, maybe giving, activity and mission or Bible study, things like that. Also in the board covenant would be like, we're going to covenant to read the consent calendar and the packet ahead of the meetings and come prepared, and to be fully present, maybe that we're not going to miss so many meetings in a year, whatever you want that to be. Go ahead and set your calendar for the whole year to make planning easy. Assign your leadership development, determine what you're going to do for leadership development and spiritual formation, and go ahead and assign those tasks. And you might do a broad overview of what to expect for the year. So that would be your January meeting. February, you're coming up upon Easter. You might start talking about the overall like church plans for Easter, the big picture things. You might start looking at some statistical trends. Your pastor is hard at work at year-end statistics right now, and those are due at the end of the month. And so they're usually ready in February. And so you might, as a board, look at those. Look at those statistical trends at your February meeting. And you also might look at facility improvement plans at the beginning of the year, right? Like, here's our budget that we've set for building improvement. and we've got a full year, what needs to be done, kind of as a board go through those kinds of things. In March, you might have a town hall meeting, right? That's, you know, a third of the, or yeah, you're a little few months into the year, have a town hall meeting, get feedback from the church. In April, you might do a deep financial dive, begin that stewardship campaign planning. That might seem like it's pretty early to start doing that. But you know, if you're planning on doing, if you do that in the fall, that's, you know, and you think about summertime, people being away, April may not be a bad idea to begin planning your stewardship campaign. May for your, then again, this is the generative work and strategic work part of that the agenda that I sent you. This is that's what all this stuff is. Anyway, so May, you might just review your policies and procedures, make sure they're up to date, see if that, you know, if you need to edit or change or add or take away anything. June, you're halfway through the year, and this would be a good time to kind of deep dive into your goals. Do you need to make any shifts for the second half of the year? Have you already met one goal, or do you need to like maybe reevaluate the measurement of one goal based on what you've experienced and make any shifts for that for the second half of the year? In July, you might be expecting a new pastor. This might be a good time to do a town hall. You want to think about, you know, plans to be made with your new pastor. And then in August, you might talk about preparations for your strategic planning retreat. I have a whole thing about that too. That's a whole other resource and topic, but that's something your board might look at doing, is doing a strategic planning retreat to the end of the year in preparation for the new year. So you might want to make some plans, start making some plans for that to happen in the fall. September is when you want to do that retreat. This is when nominations begins. So you want to start discerning new leadership for the upcoming year. And this would be a great time to review some of the new people, right? Hopefully you've had some visitors or maybe some new leaders, and begin to start talking about and naming those folks to help the nominations committee with their work. October is big month. That's when you're doing your clergy evaluations. You've got church conference. It's also, by the way, clergy appreciation. So show your clergy some love during October. Talk about how you might do that. And then hopefully you would be receiving budget requests at that point as well. November, you're going to finalize your budget and look at some new leadership training. Because you've already done your charge conference, so you know who your new board is going to be, and so you might want to go ahead and train them before you jump into the holidays. And then December, you might just have a state of the church town hall, where your pastor kind of gives an overview of how the church is doing, and maybe cast some kind of hope or vision for the next year to come. Let's see, I went through that really quickly, so I'm going to exit out of how do I exit? Stop share, duh. Where is that? Oh, there, sorry, y'all. It's been a little while. All right. I hope we've got some questions. Chris, do we have
We do,
questions?
Katie.
All right, let's hear them.
The first question is, well, and there's a couple of questions that follow this sort of same line of thinking, is when it comes to trustees and SPRC and even nominations, do they continue the 3-year rotation? How does that work with those roles as compared to a traditional structure?
Yes, so if you're not used to doing classes, and I would venture to say a lot of you have been on a committee for quite some time and have not rotated off yet. This is a great time to begin introducing classes. So yes, you want 3 people, ideally 3 people in each class. And some churches kind of work into this, since it's a new model. You don't want to start with like a whole new group of people. So you might work into it, but yeah, you want to have 3 classes of 3 people each. That's the recommended structure. And so people are rotating off every 3 years. You're giving, and let's do that, y'all. Let's give our leaders a break, right? and then they're welcome to come back on after a year of rest. But yes, we are introducing, if you haven't practiced having classes and rotating your leaders on a 3-year cycle, this is the prime time to do it. I just saw, yeah.
Another question as it relates to SPRC is how did those meetings happen within the bigger picture? Does that meet separately? Is that a closed? Because traditionally SPRC is a closed meeting because of confidentiality. So what are the logistics of that part of a single board meeting?
It's a great question. Yes, so it's important to let your congregation know that board meetings are open. This is not, it's not 9 people behind closed doors conniving and making decisions for the church, but meetings are open. So you want to make that clear. I mean, I've done a lot of trainings and talked to a lot of people. I've never had a lot of like random like church members come to a meeting because normally people don't like meetings. But if you happen to have people that are not part of the board at your meeting, you would do all the business, and then at the very end, you would do your SPRC work and say, thank you for coming. At this point, we are going to have a closed meeting to talk about, personnel or SPRC matters. So we're going to, excuse you. So yeah, you would want to do those things at the end of the meeting. And again, everybody on the board is a part of SPRC. So they're obviously just going to stay, but so that would only if you have people that are non-voting board members present, do you need to make it clear that this is when we're doing the SPRC work? So yes, that's a great question. And I did see, I had the chat open for a second and I saw somebody talk about their small church and it's hard to rotate. Yes, I'm glad you said that because a lot of this model was made for small churches who could not fill an entire nominations form. And so you just do the best you can, right? Again, all of this is best practice. We just don't want to wear our leaders out. So if you have the pool of people to pull from, utilize that, right? Don't wear your leaders out. But yeah, like I said, if you've got to work with what you have and build from that. So it's not, nobody's going to police you nobody's policing this to make sure you have a 3-year rotation if you have a really small church. So yeah, I hear that. Just do the best you can and don't wear your leaders out.
Yeah, well, this is Max Stedman. I have a question as far as the goals established by the board. Is that executed by the board? And let me tell you why I'm asking that. Is that we have a situation where our board, or not a board, but our committee chairs, okay, are not as active as they should be, okay? So what we're looking for is a way of having the same goals, but basically assisting that chairman with the actual grunt work with members of the board. Is that doable, or what is the expectation of the execution of the goals established by the board?
Yeah, that's great. That's a really great question. I mean, it depends on the pool of people you have to work from. And smaller churches, the people on the board are also going to be your worker bees, unfortunately, right? But it sounds like you all have like other committees in place. So the board, again, is going to hold those committees accountable to is going to follow up, and maybe the board provides some suggestions, some helpful like, so here's the first, if a committee, if you've given a committee a task or a goal that they're supposed to work on, but you see that they're having trouble, the board, it's their responsibility to provide maybe some coaching, right? So here's the first thing you might do, ... Or ask the question, how can we help? That's a great question for the board to bring to those committee chairs, is how can we help?
And I understand, I think we get, and I'm just talking about my church, we get caught in, you're the chair, so you should set your own goals and report back to the board or to council, okay? And I think that's where we're running into a roadblock, okay? Is that, I don't think we should say, okay, you're chairman, you figure it out. Okay, you tell us what you're going to do. It seems like that direction should come from a concerted effort of a board. And that's why I'm interested in single board Because if nothing else,
Yeah.
those goals out to the various committees.
Right, it helps just get everybody on the same page, right? Because then you have committees with their own agendas, and they might be good agendas, but they're just not cohesive. And so then you've got the church operating in all these different silos
Mhm.
and not as a cohesive whole. And so, it's just really important for the church to buy into this single board and to be able to give voice to what those goals and visions should be.
Mhm.
But for the board that has the discernment and the responsibility of helping really kind of define what those are alongside the pastor, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, yeah, does that help?
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, good. What's next, Chris?
There's a question, it kind of goes along with what Mac asked a little bit. Mary asked, in the accountability piece, when you invite commitment, how does the board discern if they actually have buy-in from the congregation on a really big initiative?
How does the board discern if they have buy-in from the congregation on a really big initiative? Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah. Is this where
That's it.
town hall meetings might come into play?
That's exactly what I was gonna say, is you gotta have those town hall meetings. And whatever works for your context. I think in my context, if I were to have a town hall meeting, it would be right after church. Right? Stay after church, we're gonna have a quick town hall meeting. You might do it in conjunction with like a regular, if you still do like a weeknight, church night, you might do it then. But whatever works for your context, you definitely would want to have a town hall meeting. Because most often when there's not buy-in, I would venture to say it's because people don't know or are unaware. And we think we've told them in writing, but people don't read their bulletins. Um, and they may not read their email. They probably don't read their email. And so having a town hall meeting, yeah, that's a whole other leadership, like, uh, skill of that, inviting buy-in and creating buy-in. But the best way to do that would be through some town halls and maybe surveys. I just sent out a survey to my church a couple weeks ago, inviting some ideas and stuff, feedback. So there's lots of ideas and ways to do that, but it would be really important on a big initiative to make sure you have buy-in.
This is my one
Maybe.
additional question that on the accountability piece. What does that look like?
What do
Accountability.
you, well, it depends on do you have a specific?
Oh, no, the statement was made that we need to have the committees accountable. Okay.
Oh, yeah, so that's
What
really
does that look like?
follow-up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's follow-up, right?
Yes, I'm sorry.
You
Yeah.
have a goal and you have tasked a team to work towards that goal. And so you're just checking in. How's it going? What's working? What's not? How can we help? So that's what the accountability, it is gentle, right? And it's intended to be helpful, not like, I got you, you're not doing it. It's not shaming at all. There's accountability is not shaming. And that's probably why we've steered away from it, but really is like, we've noticed this isn't working really well. So let's revisit that. How can we help you? Do we need to change things? So that's kind of what that accountability is, but you've got to be very specific, right? If we just say we're going to create a random team that's responsible for outreach, and that's all we give them without defining what that means,
Mhm.
what we expect, having a job description. We can't hold anybody accountable if we don't have expectations in place. And so it's really recommended that maybe one of the things the board does is create job descriptions for each of your teams. I know that I would have loved that as like a regular lay person, if I were going to say yes to to some committee calling me, to know what I was saying yes to. And so yeah, you can't hold people accountable if you don't have expectations kind of in place and stated. So that's another piece of the board. Great question.
Katie, maybe you can put that simple acronym back up for the accountability,
Yeah.
just to remind folks of that sort of process that you shared. And then as you're looking for that and doing that, another question came up about nominations team. How does the nominations team work in conjunction with this single board structure?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. I have a whole other workshop on nominations for your nominations team. So hopefully your nominations team is meeting more than once or twice a year towards nominations time. But this process, because it's 9 people, you're not going to go looking through your directory and saying, well, who hasn't served in a long time? They haven't. Well, why don't you call them? Because they're going to say yes to you. They won't say yes to me, right? Like we've all been in nominations committee meetings that were like that. I know I have. I've been part of them. And so that's not the nominations process here. Because you want your most spiritually mature, your most committed and dedicated, your big thinkers, maybe not necessarily your worker bees, because we want them to do the work, but your strategic planners, your visionaries, these are the people you want on your board. And so nominations were also, when I coach churches in this model, I do a separate training for nominations that kind of invites them into a call process that's very different, right? And I can send you all of this information if you want to know about the nominations process. I can send you my PowerPoints and my worksheet, or my documents and all that stuff. But you're really doing more of a call process, right? You're maybe come together as a nominations, and you kind of first start with, what do we need in our leaders on the single board, right? What are some of the qualities that we're looking for in a leader, some of the markers that we want for commitment and member, and participation. Start with that, right? What does an ideal leader look like? And then maybe you're sitting in the room and you spend some time in silence, right? Just kind of inviting God's spirit in the place. And maybe and you just say a name as they come to you, trusting that the spirit is leading you, and you write that down. You might do that for several people. You might write a bunch of names down that come to you, and then talk about each one, right? Is this the right time for them? Based on what we know about their life situation and what they have going on, is this the right time for them? And so anyway, I don't want to go through the whole nominations thing, because you all aren't the nominations committee. I hope not, because that's not very good practice. Hopefully all of you have a separate nominations committee, because the board can't be self-nominating. But it's really important for the nominations committee to know what the role of the board is, so that they can ensure that they are selecting, or asking, I should not say selecting, asking the right people. And for them to be doing that throughout the year, right? One church I was working with, they were like, we are the leaders. Like there's nobody else. Like, this is it. The people in this room are the ones that are most active and committed. So I told them, I was like, work with what you got, right? Stay with this as long as you can. But maybe one of your goals this year is to develop some new leaders. And that's where the nominations, it's really nominations and leadership development. And Mary John Dye is leading a nominations training right now. So if you have folks on nominations, I would recommend they go look at that, because I think she kind of encourages more of a call process. So I hope that answers that question.
And then I think the last question, if I didn't miss anything, was sort of about, you mentioned a stewardship campaign. How does that work within the leadership team? Is there a separate group of people that puts on the stewardship campaign, or is that the leadership team? How have you seen that work?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Y'all have good questions. So the board would set the overall, like, maybe the board might determine when. And the board might say, let's appoint a task force that's going to be responsible for this, and let's ask this person to head that up. Because maybe there's one person in your church who's really good at that stuff and likes to do it and kind of knows the people. You obviously want your pastor to be a part of that. So yeah, the board would kind of determine when it might take place and that it needs to take place and ensure that there's somebody in the church planning it, right? And the board might follow up and say, how are plans coming along? So it's really, yeah, I wouldn't recommend that the board get into the details of it, because that's kind of the management piece. And that's not necessarily big picture, but the board is going to make sure that there's a task force maybe that does the stewardship planning. So they're just kind of overseeing and making sure it happens. So I hope that answers that question.
And there is one more question that I missed. Do
Okay.
boards publish minutes of major decisions?
Oh, yes, great question. Yes, these, like I said, the last part, when I went over the agenda, there's a communication piece on the agenda. And after every meeting, there needs to be a decision on what decisions were made and what needs to be communicated. So yeah, this will not work if there's not good communication with the church, because it requires a lot of trust, right? For a congregation to like put their trust in 9 people. And one way to build that trust and keep it ongoing is to communicate. So yes, you do want to communicate. And I don't have a prescribed way of how to communicate that, because that's totally different for each context. And how you might do that. I mean, you could communicate it over social media if that's something that you guys are really active in, or you might just have like a newsletter or an email. But it really is important, yes, that the board determines what information needs to be communicated, and how. So yes, communication is key. I'm curious from you all, if you could put this in the chat, just share in the chat how long your church has been utilizing if you're already practicing it, how long your church has been utilizing a single board. I'd love for y'all to put that in the chat if you could. Oh, I see somebody, I just opened the chat and saw that somebody asked about a cooperative parish. And there is a model for that, about having a single board for cooperative parish. And it's Renee, yeah. Renee, if you will, I'll share my email at the end. If you'll shoot me an email, I'll share with you where you can find those resources for a cooperative parish to use a single board. But yeah, there definitely is one in there. Let's see, we've got some folks doing their first year. All right, that's wonderful. Going into 6 years. That's fabulous. Some of y'all are very new. Yeah, just forming.
And just as a
Okay.
reminder for everyone, if you join, you should have gotten an email about joining Whova and creating an account there. All of the presentation information is going to be in Whova, and this is being recorded, so it will be available at a later time for you to come back and watch or share with others.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, so we do have several of you that have been doing this a while. I mean, we have time, so I'd love to give you all an opportunity to just connect with each other. That's one of the hopes of this whole Equip Connect conference, is for our laity to connect with each other. So what we're going to do is Chris is going to send you in breakout groups. Let's see, we've got, how many people are 50 people? Yeah, let's stick with we'll do groups of 4. We don't want to get too big. But it'll be randomized. And what I would like for you to share is maybe, so if you have been practicing this if you've been implementing this for a year or more, what are some of the best practices that you have, that you've experienced? And then if you are just starting it, why don't you share what you're looking forward to and what you hope to, what new thing you hope to see come from using a single board. Okay, so if you've been practicing this and if you've had this in place for more than a year, you're going to talk about some of your best practices, some of the things that you have found that work. And then if you're brand new, what are you excited about? Or what are your hopes? And we'll just spend, let's see, if we've got 4 people. I always find that breakout groups don't go as long as I would like. So let's do 10 minutes. That should give everybody a chance. Go ahead and introduce yourselves too once you get in there. And then you can have some conversations and connect. Oh, and we're losing people. This will be the, but if you come back, right, go to the breakout groups. And if you come back, we'll do, I'll share some final resources with you. I'll share those in the chat. And then I think we're going to get out of here early tonight. So if you are hoping to connect with people, stick around, and Chris is going to send us out in our breakout groups, and I'll see y'all back here in about 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll send you now.
All right, here we go. There's my email, but Chris also put it in the chat. This is the book that my colleague Gloria Hughes and I created kind of a separate training using this like PowerPoints and stuff like that, using Stephen Ross's Simple Governance, but Kay Cotan also, that Mission Possible book. She also informs some of our work. Stephen Ross, Kay Cotan comes from a business background, and she's in the church now. But that book can be a little intimidating for some people because it's like huge. Stephen Ross book is maybe a little more accessible to folks. And like I said, he ties in more scripture and more spiritual discipleship pieces to it. So we just found that to be a more accessible resource to churches. But they're both really good. Mission Possible is really a step-by-step guide. And so I do recommend churches, if they haven't read this and they're looking to implement, or they already are, to read this book. If you read it, a lot of the things that I've said will sound very familiar to you. And so I credit a lot of the stuff is coming from Stephen Ross. So I wanted to make sure I shared that. Again, there's my email. If you want me to share any of those resources that I've created using the Stephen Ross stuff, I am happy to do that. And if you have a DVA, well, all your districts have a DVA, but your DVA also knows might also, depending on what district you're in, might also have those resources, or they know how to get them for you. And so your DVA is a really good resource as well. I will, last chance to ask any burning questions. What if your church is a separate SPRC? How do the two interact? Does your ad council chair attend the SPRC? That's a really great question. Oh yeah, Chris, thanks. DVA is our insider language. District Vitality Associate. That's who you're looking for in the district. If your church is a separate SPRC, because that's not something I've worked with a lot, because most of the churches our district superintendent's okay with that. So there just definitely needs to be some kind of communication. So I definitely would want maybe someone from SPRC to be on your governance board. But yeah, you definitely want to have some kind of communication there. And so maybe yeah, ad council chair. Yeah, you would have one person that's kind of, and maybe the SPRC chairperson is the one that's on the board as well. That might be easiest way to streamline that. What about ministry subgroup of the board? What do they do? Do you mean, Kathy, like teams, and like if you have like a worship committee, or is that what you
Yeah.
mean? Yeah, okay,
We have a
perfect.
lot of ministries. It's kind
Yeah,
of like council on ministries, really. But we're calling
okay.
it ministry team.
Well, so the board would dictate what teams are needed, and maybe even set those job descriptions. And the ministry team could certainly inform that, but because the vision and everything the church is about is kind of coming from this vision that's coming from the board, the board would help guide the work of your ministry teams. Part of the training that I do with our churches in our district includes or the introductory workshop includes a organizational chart, and it shows that you would have those different ministry teams, but the board, but your pastor is the one that manages those, right? So the board is accountable to Christ, the pastor is accountable to the board, and your working teams or your paid or unpaid staff are accountable to your pastor. But the board would write the job descriptions for those teams and help kind of guide their work. So that's what that relationship would look like. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, just a quick question about the subgroup. So in the board, there is 9 or 11 members, and like SPRC Act, 3 or people is needed. Finance works, another some people, but is it only the group like SPRC group from among the single board, or SPRC group can be formed out of the single board, and so the finance and so the other is needed out of the board members also they can form their own subgroups, or it should be from within the single board members?
Yeah, so that's creates it wouldn't necessarily, but it could create like silos. And so hopefully the board, everybody on the board are those committees that you don't have, it's not representatives, right? You don't have a representative on the board from the finance committee. That's just a regular church council that has, but so for like example, the board may not get into the nitty-gritty of the budget, right? So they might say, get your financial secretary and whoever's your finance guru and say, why don't you guys, separate task force, meet to give us a preliminary budget that we can talk about. Right. So you just kind of, the board's just kind of appointing those task forces. But no, not a separate, like a whole separate finance council meeting. Because if any finance council conversations would happen with the board. The only case where there might be a separate, which would be SPRC. And again, that's not necessarily best practice, but it's certainly fine, especially if your district superintendent is uncomfortable with SPRC being incorporated in that. Does that answer your question, Santos?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Good. All right. Is there anything else? Well, I
Yes, I have one
appreciate you
quick
all.
question.
Oh yeah, go on, Mac. What's up?
If you're planning to, or you want to implement a single board, what is your recommendation on the process of deconstructing what's already existing?
There's a whole process for that if you're brand new and discerning, and that includes maybe doing like an evaluation of how things function as right now. And Mac, I can send you the whole discernment thing. A lot of that is in Keiko-Tan's. Keiko-Tan goes very heavily into like the discernment piece. But this is the great time, Mac. If you have not started implementing this, but you want to next year, this is the time to do it, right? To begin having those conversations, get your pastor on board, and begin kind of introducing it to the congregation in hopes that maybe, next year it's something you can implement. But a lot of conversation, read simple governance, get other people to read simple governance and begin to have some conversation. But if you haven't implemented yet and you want to next year, this is the prime time to begin doing that, because it could take a while depending on your context. But
Okay.
again, Mac, if you check out those 2 books, they'll help you with some step-by-step guides.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, Well, y'all have been wonderful. I hope this was helpful. And you have my contact now. If you have other questions that come up for you in the future, I'm really grateful for Chris for managing the chat. She's so good at that. Yeah. Can I let me send you forth with a blessing. As you all leave this place, I pray that the Lord would fill you with all courage to make bold decisions, but wisdom to be able to make those decisions based on where the Spirit is guiding you. And that through this simplified, unified structure, you are able to live into the God-sized dreams that you have for your church, and that your community knows that when they pass by, they know that is a church that knows Jesus and is about the business of Jesus. And so I just wish you many blessings in the midst of this, and pray that you give yourself some patience if you're new to this, and figuring it out. It takes a while to make some of these changes. And so just know that you're doing great work, and I send God's blessings with you to go and be the church and be faithful disciples for him. God bless you all. Have a great evening.